The first thing Caleb Turner noticed about the woman standing on his neighbor's porch was how still she was, like someone who had already learned that moving too much invited disappointment. And from the dirt road where his horse slowed to a halt, he could see her clutching a small carpetbag to her chest, as if it were the last thing in the world she owned. The late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the pine boards of the abandoned cabin beside his own, the cabin that belonged, at least on paper, to Henry Wilkes, a man who had sent for a mail-order bride and then vanished 3 weeks before she arrived, leaving nothing but unpaid debts, unopened letters, and now this woman, alone, frightened, and clearly realizing that she had crossed half a continent to meet a ghost. Caleb dismounted slowly, aware of how a lone man approaching a stranded woman could look, and cleared his throat before she startled, her eyes lifting sharply, wide and dark and ringed with exhaustion. And when she spoke, her voice trembled despite her attempt at politeness, as she asked if he knew when her husband would be returning. And the word husband hung in the air like a lie neither of them wanted to name. Because Caleb did know, he knew Henry Wilkes wasn't coming back, knew the man had ridden out under cover of night after losing everything at cards, knew the bank would take the land by winter, and knew that no letter sent east would ever be answered. But as he looked at the woman's dust-streaked face and the faint bruise on her wrist from the long journey west, he could not bring himself to say it all at once, so he told her only that Henry had gone away and that it might be some time before he returned. And she nodded as if she had already guessed, her shoulders sagging just slightly as she thanked him and turned back toward the porch where a single unopened crate sat marked with her name, and something twisted in Caleb's chest then, because he had lived alone in his cabin for 7 years, since the fever took his parents and the war took his brother, and loneliness had become a familiar companion. But this felt different, heavier, like standing by while someone else drowned in silence. He asked her name, and she said it was Eleanor Price, from Ohio, and when he told her his own, she studied his face as if searching for cruelty or kindness, finding neither easily, and then she admitted in a quiet rush that she had no money left, that the ticket west had taken everything, that Henry's letters had promised a safe home and honest work and a chance at family, and that she did not know what to do now. And Caleb found himself saying the words before he had fully thought them through, telling her she could stay in his cabin until matters were sorted, that it wasn't much, but it was warm and solid and had food enough for 2. And when she hesitated, he added quickly that she could keep her own space, that he'd sleep by the hearth, that he wouldn't expect anything of her. And the relief that flooded her face at that moment was so raw and unguarded it struck him harder than gratitude ever could, because it carried with it the weight of weeks spent afraid. And she followed him across the clearing as the sun dipped low, her steps cautious, her eyes drinking in the sight of his modest cabin as if it were a palace. And inside, as he set water to boil and handed her a bowl of stew, she ate slowly, savoring each bite, apologizing for being a burden. And Caleb surprised himself by telling her she wasn't one, that sometimes people just needed help. And the way she smiled then, small, unsure but real, lingered with him long after. She had fallen asleep on the narrow bed, and he had taken his place on the floor, staring up at the rafters and wondering how a stranger could so suddenly shift the shape of a man's quiet life. Over the days that followed, Eleanor learned the rhythms of the land, helping tend the small garden, mending shirts by the window, and humming softly while she worked, a tune that reminded Caleb of his mother. And though she never spoke of Henry again, he could see the shame she carried, the fear that she had been foolish to trust words on paper. And one evening, as rain drummed against the roof and the world outside shrank to darkness, she confessed that she had answered the advertisement because she had no family left, because being chosen even by a stranger had seemed better than being forgotten. And Caleb listened in silence, the firelight flickering across her face, realizing that in offering her shelter, he had not simply taken in his neighbor's abandoned bride, but had opened his door to a woman whose strength had been tested beyond fairness. And as the weeks passed and the air grew colder, something unspoken settled between them, a shared understanding built from quiet meals and long looks and the comfort of knowing someone would be there in the morning. And Caleb found himself noticing the way her laughter warmed the room, the way she stood taller when she felt safe. And Eleanor began to look at him not as a rescuer, but as a man, steady, patient, kind in a way that asked for nothing in return. And when the first snow fell and she stood at the window watching it drift down, she whispered that she had never known a place could feel like home. And Caleb knew then that whatever came next would change them both forever. Because love, when it arrived, rarely announced itself loudly, but instead took root quietly, in cabins meant for one, in promises never written, and in hearts that had long believed themselves beyond saving. Winter tightened its grip on the valley with a quiet relentlessness, the kind that crept into bones and made even the strongest timbers groan at night. And within Caleb Turner's cabin the days began to take on a shape neither he nor Eleanor had planned for, but both slowly came to depend on. Mornings marked by shared coffee brewed thin to make it last. Evenings by the soft crackle of the fire and the sound of wind, pressing against the walls as if testing whether the small refuge would endure. And in that closeness something delicate began to form, not rushed or declared, but grown patiently like a seed buried deep beneath frozen soil. Eleanor took to rising early, wrapping herself in one of Caleb's spare coats and stepping outside to feed the chickens or sweep the porch, her breath clouding in the air. And Caleb watched her sometimes from the doorway, struck by how she moved with quiet determination, how she never complained of the cold or the uncertainty that still hovered over her future. And yet there were moments when he would catch her staring toward the road, her eyes shadowed with questions she did not ask. And those moments reminded him that she was still tethered to a past neither of them could undo. One afternoon, as they repaired a fence together, a rider passed by and tipped his hat, calling out a greeting that included Henry Wilkes's name, and Eleanor froze, the hammer slipping from her hand as the truth of her situation rushed back in full force. And that night she sat rigid at the table, barely touching her food, until finally she asked Caleb, in a voice barely above a whisper, whether the town thought ill of her, whether she was now something shameful, a woman claimed and abandoned. And Caleb answered without hesitation that no one who knew the full story would judge her, that Henry's failures were his own. And when she looked unconvinced, he added that if anyone dared speak against her, he would set them straight, surprising even himself. Toggle. No, continue. Surprising even himself with the firmness of his conviction. And in that moment, Eleanor saw not just kindness, but protection, something solid to lean against. And tears slipped down her cheeks as she thanked him for standing beside her when the world had not. As the days shortened, they spoke more freely, sharing fragments of their pasts in pieces small enough not to overwhelm. Caleb admitting that after the war he had believed himself incapable of loving anything, fragile for fear of losing it. Eleanor confessing that she had learned early to make herself useful so she would be kept. And those confessions lingered between them, knitting a fragile trust that neither named but both felt. And when a storm trapped them inside for 3 days, snow piling so high it sealed the door, they passed the time reading old newspapers aloud, laughing at advertisements promising miracles. And in that laughter something eased, the heaviness lifting just enough to let warmth through. It was on the third night, when the fire burned low and Eleanor's hands shook from the cold despite the blankets, that Caleb reached out without thinking and wrapped his arm around her shoulders, intending only to steady her. And she leaned into him instinctively, resting her head against his chest as if it were the most natural thing in the world. And the silence that followed was not awkward but profound, filled with the steady rhythm of two hearts finding a shared pace. And when she eventually pulled away, her cheeks were flushed not with embarrassment, but with something softer, something hopeful. And she whispered that she felt safe, a word that struck Caleb harder than any declaration of love ever could. Yet safety did not erase reality, and when the snow melted and spring threatened to return, the question of Eleanor's future rose again, this time sharper, because a letter arrived from the town office addressed to Henry Wilkes, stating plainly that the land would be seized if back taxes were not paid. And Eleanor read it with shaking hands, her face pale, as she realized that even the illusion of marriage now tethered her to trouble. And she insisted that she could not stay, that she would find work in town or move on further west, that she could not drag Caleb down with a debt that was not his. And the thought of her leaving carved something raw inside him, though he tried to hide it by agreeing too quickly, telling her she deserved a future unburdened by someone else's mistakes. They spent the following days in a strained politeness, both aware of the coming separation, but unwilling to speak it aloud, until one evening Eleanor returned from town later than usual, her eyes red and her posture defeated, and confessed that no one would hire her. Once they learned she was a mail-order bride without a husband, that pity was offered freely, but opportunity was not. And Caleb felt anger flare in him then, not toward her, but toward a world so quick to judge and discard. And he told her she could stay as long as she wished, that the cabin was hers as much as his. And though she tried to protest, he stopped her gently, saying that sometimes helping someone was not a burden, but a privilege. And she looked at him with such intensity that for a moment he feared she might name what they both felt. But instead, she reached out and squeezed his hand, a silent thank you that carried more weight than words. As spring finally broke through, the land softened, and with it the barriers between them thinned, and Eleanor began to smile more easily, to hum again as she worked. And Caleb found himself planning days around her presence, saving stories to tell her at night, imagining futures he had long since abandoned. And when a traveling preacher arrived in town and spoke of forgiveness and new beginnings, Eleanor returned thoughtful, asking Caleb whether he believed people could truly start over. And he answered honestly that he didn't know, but that he hoped so, because there were some beginnings worth fighting for. The unspoken truth hovered closer then, tangible and electric. And one night, as they sat on the porch watching fireflies spark in the dusk, Eleanor finally asked the question that had haunted her since she arrived. Whether Caleb saw her as a guest who would someday leave or as something more permanent. And he stared out at the darkening fields, his chest tight, before turning to her and saying that he had stopped thinking of her as temporary weeks ago, that the thought of the cabin without her felt wrong, empty, and when she heard that, relief and fear warred across her face, because wanting something did not make it easy or safe, and she admitted that she was afraid to hope, afraid that choosing love again might lead only to loss. And Caleb told her that fear was the price of caring, but that he was willing to pay it if she was. And though neither reached for the other then, the promise hung between them, fragile and bright, like the first stars appearing overhead, signaling that the long night of loneliness was nearing its end. And if you feel the pull of this slow-burning frontier love, don't walk away now. Subscribe to the channel, because in the final chapter, a choice will be made that changes everything for Eleanor and Caleb forever.